Okay, good morning, everybody. This is the video podcast to make up for the endocrine lab, which we missed during the snow day that we had at the beginning of the term. And what we're going over here in this particular exercise is the location of particular endocrine organs. Okay, and so what you want to do here is look at this diagram, and before we go through the answers, let's just see if we can figure them out. Okay. On the back side of the brain here is the pineal gland, which secretes melatonin and controls our circadian rhythm, our sleep-wake cycles. On the front side of the brainstem, hanging by a stalk called the infundibulum underneath the hypothalamus, is a gland called the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland used to be nicknamed the master gland because it secretes hormones that control other endocrine organs, in addition to hormones that control things like milk production and the growth of the entire body. Moving down, this gland here is called the thyroid gland. It sits right in front of the trachea, and it secretes two hormones, thyroxine and triiodothyroidine, which is abbreviated T3. These hormones control your basal metabolic rate. There's also another hormone that's secreted by the thyroid gland called calcitonin, which tends to lower blood calcium levels. On the backside of the thyroid gland are four P-shaped glands called the parathyroid glands. They're on the posterior lateral margins of the thyroid, and they secrete a hormone called parathyroid hormone, which tends to increase blood calcium levels by increasing calcium absorption at the kidneys and from the GI, and also contributing to the demineralization of bone. Moving down, this gland is the thymus gland. The thymus gland basically is T cell school. This is where the T lymphocytes get a chemical education in how to fight disease. They become immunocompetent. The hormones made here are called thymosins and thymulins, and they are chemical signals that cause lymphocytes to mature. Moving down, these are the renal glands, the kidneys, and on top of each renal gland is the adrenal gland. Okay, the adrenal gland has two layers. Its outer layer is called the cortex, and the inner portion of the gland is called the medulla. Let's start with the medulla. The adrenal medulla is actually a modified set of nerve cells called chromaffin cells, and under stimulation from the sympathetic nervous system, they secrete a couple of hormones called adrenaline and noradrenaline, which are also sometimes called epinephrine and norepinephrine. And what these hormones do is they facilitate the fight or flight response. They accelerate respiratory rate, heart rate. They accelerate the rate of gluconeogenesis and glycogenolysis. They cause you to retain water so that you can increase your blood pressure, and they essentially prepare the body for an emergency situation. So this is actually in the medulla modified nerve tissue. The outer layer of the adrenal gland is called the cortex, and the cortex is divided into three layers. Okay, and the way I remember what hormones these three layers produce is the acronym SALT, sugar, sex. Okay, the outer layer of the cortex, called the zona glomerulosa, secretes the hormone aldosterone, which is your salt retaining hormone. This is one of the hormones involved in electrolyte balance and in water retention. The middle layer of the cortex secretes glucocorticoids, the major one being cortisol, and its effect is to elevate blood sugar levels. And the inner layer of the cortex secretes sex steroids, androgens, which mimic the action of testosterone, and they control the expression of secondary sex characteristics. Okay, moving down, this tadpole-shaped organ here is called the pancreas. The pancreas is wedged between the first portion of the intestine, called the duodenum, and the spleen, which is over here. And the endocrine portion of the pancreas are called the beta islet areas of the gland. Okay, the beta islet cells are in the islets of Langerhans, along with the alpha islet cells, and this is the endocrine function of the pancreas, which is to control blood sugar levels. Insulin, remember, is a hormone that's secreted in response to high blood sugar levels, and what it does is lower blood sugar, while glucagon is secreted in response to low blood sugar levels, and its effect is to raise blood sugar. The pancreas is also an exocrine organ. It produces digestive enzymes that help us chemically break down carbohydrates, fats, and proteins by secreting them into the pancreatic duct, which eventually is going to empty into the duodenum as it receives contents from the stomach, which is right about here. Okay. Moving down, here we have a hermaphrodite, right? Because we have both male and female gonads here. Let's take the female gonads first. The female gonads are the ovaries, and the major hormones secreted by the ovaries are estrogen and progesterone, and they regulate the female reproductive cycle and the expression of female secondary sex characteristics, such as the production of breast tissue, the distribution of body fat, and changes that are associated with lactation. The male gonads are called the testes, and they're actually outside the body cavity, and they sit in a sac called the scrotum. And their main hormone is testosterone, which controls sperm production and the expression of male secondary sex characteristics. So if we look at the exercise up here, you can see the correct entries for each of these exercises. Okay, moving on to exercise 2, the pituitary gland. Okay. The pituitary gland is located just underneath the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus basically controls it. And it has two lobes, the anterior and posterior pituitary. The anterior lobe of the pituitary gland actually comes from tissue that's derived from the pharyngeal pouch during embryonic development. And so it's not nerve tissue at all, it is glandular tissue. And it communicates with the hypothalamus through the hypothalamo-hypophyseal portal system, which is a series of capillaries that exist both in the hypothalamus and are closely linked to capillaries that exist in the anterior pituitary. The reason for this arrangement of blood vessels is so that releasing factors that are produced by the hypothalamus can enter the bloodstream very easily and be carried quickly to the anterior pituitary, where they instruct the anterior pituitary to release its trophic hormones, whatever hormone the body needs at that moment. You can see here that um, the production of these hormones by the hypothalamus is actually carried out by neurons. These are neurons here. These are cell bodies, dendrites, and these are axons down here. And of course, this is the root to the anterior pituitary. The posterior pituitary is different. The posterior pituitary is actually an extension of the brain, and the hormones that the posterior pituitary secretes are manufactured by the hypothalamus, and they're stored in the posterior pituitary until they need to be used. And the two main hormones that it produces are oxytocin, which is active in uterine contractions and in the ejection of milk, and vasopressin, also known as ADH, which stands for antidiuretic hormone, which is our water retaining hormone. This is one of the hormones that controls our fluid balance and also regulates our blood pressure. And you can see here that in both the anterior and posterior lobes, we have a lot of blood vessels. It's highly vascularized. And that makes a lot of sense because you need to be near the blood supply if you're an endocrine gland in order to effectively release your chemical signal into the bloodstream. And so you can see here the correct answers to the exercise, right? The anterior pituitary indicated by 2. Of course, these are the capillaries here indicated by 3. Okay, capillaries in both the posterior and anterior pituitary. The hypophyseal portal vessels indicated by 1. Okay, connecting these two capillary beds. The hypothalamus up here indicated by 5. The infundibulum, the stalk that connects the pituitary to the hypothalamus, indicated here by 6. The neurons, of course, indicated by 4. And, of course, the posterior pituitary indicated by 7. Okay. Okay, another name for the anterior pituitary is the adenohypophysis. And another name for the posterior pituitary is the neural hypophysis. Remember that these are two distinctly different types of tissue. Under a microscope, the posterior pituitary will be populated primarily by neurons and blood vessels, whereas the anterior pituitary will be populated by secretory cells and blood vessels, and you won't see any nervous tissue in this gland at all. Okay, moving down. Around the lab, if we had conducted this particular exercise, we would have had several models, and what would have been labeled for you to see would have been the thyroid, which would have sat in front of the trachea, the pituitary, which we would have shown you on a sagittal view of the head and neck region. This is the gland that sits just in front of the brainstem and below the hypothalamus. The pineal gland, which of course is on the back of the brainstem. The pancreas, which we indicated its location earlier between the spleen and the duodenum and behind the stomach. And of course the adrenal glands, which sit on top of each kidney. Okay, this is the matching exercise. Okay, you can glance at this for, let's give you 30 seconds. Okay, moving down. We would have had slides of endocrine organs in the lab for you to look at. Of course, we didn't have functional microscopes, so what I would suggest that you do is take a peek at the slides of endocrine tissue in the lecture notes on Chapter 17 and familiarize yourself with the appearance of thyroid tissue, the appearance of pituitary tissue, the appearance of pancreatic tissue, the appearance of the testes and the ovaries under the microscope. Basically all the endocrine glands that we've discussed, so that you know them if you were to see a tissue section on a microscope slide. Okay, moving down. Okay, the next thing we want to do is we want to talk a little bit about how certain hormones function. Okay, these are actually videos that you would have seen in the lecture, but I want to go ahead and splice these in, and then there are some questions that you'll want to be able to answer that are basically handouts that go along with this particular laboratory. Okay, so let's watch those.
Steroid hormones are not water-soluble. They travel in the blood attached to protein carriers. When steroid hormones arrive at their target cells, they dissociate from their protein carriers and pass through the plasma membrane of the cell. Some steroid hormones bind to specific receptor proteins in the cytoplasm and then move as a hormone receptor complex into the nucleus. Other steroids travel directly into the nucleus before encountering their receptor proteins, not shown. The hormone receptor protein, activated by binding to the hormone, is now able to bind to specific regions of the DNA. These DNA regions are known as the hormone response elements. The binding of the hormone receptor complex has a direct effect on the level of transcription at that site. Messenger RNA, mRNA, is produced, which then codes for the synthesis of specific proteins. Thyroxine is a water-insoluble hormone that is brought to the target cell via a protein carrier. Because it is lipophilic, thyroxine can easily pass through the cell membrane. Thyroxine contains 4 iodines and is often abbreviated T4, tetraiodothyronine. The thyroid gland also secretes smaller amounts of a similar molecule that has only 3 iodines, called triiodothyronine, T3. Both hormones enter target cells, but all the T4 that enters is converted into T3. Thus, only the T3 form of the hormone enters the nucleus and binds to nuclear receptor proteins. The hormone receptor protein complex, in turn, binds to the appropriate hormone response elements on DNA. The binding of the hormone receptor complex has a direct effect on the level of transcription at the site where it binds. The messenger RNA, mRNA, produced then codes for specific proteins. When a signal molecule, such as epinephrine, binds to a cell surface receptor protein, it activates a G protein on the inside of the cell. The G protein then stimulates adenylyl cyclase to produce large amounts of cyclic AMP from ATP within the cell. The cyclic AMP then binds to and activates a target protein, such as alpha kinase, which adds phosphates to specific proteins in the cell. The effect of this phosphorylation depends on the identity of the cell and the proteins that are phosphorylated.
Okay, so now that you've seen those videos, we can go through each of these questions and answer them appropriately. So the first question, after you've downloaded the endocrine system video document, what types of hormones do not enter cells? And those would be peptide hormones and amino acid derivatives, such as catecholamines. Okay, let's highlight that in red. Next question. What does epinephrine cause to happen in liver cells? And that is gluconeogenesis and glycogenolysis. Okay, and you might ask, well, what are those? What are those processes? Gluconeogenesis is the production of new glucose from non-carbohydrate precursors such as stored fat, and glycogenolysis is the breakdown of glycogen, which is a glucose polymer, to produce glucose to introduce into the blood. Okay, what is the second messenger in a liver cell? And that's cyclic AMP. Okay, AMP capital. And remember that the purpose of second messengers is to amplify the signal inside the cell so that eventually it makes it to a terminal protein that's either going to enter the nucleus and promote transcription, or will activate a protein or a pump or some other membrane associated protein in order to cause the cell to respond in some fashion to the original ligand, which in this case would be a hormone. Okay, next question. Are steroid hormones water soluble? And the answer is no. Okay. Next question. Do steroid hormones pass through the cell membrane? And the answer is yes. Next question. What does the hormone receptor complex bind to in the cell nucleus? And that's the promoter on the DNA. And what that does is it promotes transcription of that particular gene. Next question. Binding of the hormone receptor complex has a direct effect on, and the answer is transcription. Okay. Next question. What does messenger RNA code for? And that is basically protein. These are protein instructions. Okay. How is thyroxine brought to target cells? And it's in association with thyroglobulin. And thyroglobulin is essentially a water-soluble protein that can enclose this lipid-soluble hormone so that it can easily be transported in blood plasma. Remember that thyroxine is hydrophobic, so it's not going to dissolve well in water. It, as a result, needs a vehicle. Question is, does thyroxine pass through the cell membrane? The answer is yes. Next question, what happens to T4? It is converted to T3, and that's the active form. What does T3 stand for? Triiodothyronine. That's basically a catecholamine with, it's an amino acid derivative with 3 iodine atoms attached to it. Where is the hormone response element? And it is on the DNA, and specifically, it is in the promoter. Okay? All right. Hopefully that clears everything up. We can go through these one more time real quick. Okay. First answer, what types of hormones do not enter cells? Peptide hormones and amino acid derivatives. Next question, what does epinephrine cause to happen in liver cells? Gluconeogenesis and glycogenolysis. Next question, what is the second messenger in the liver cell? That's cyclic AMP. Next question, for steroid hormones, are steroid hormones water soluble? The answer is no. Next question, do steroid hormones pass through the cell membrane? The answer is yes. Next question, what does the hormone receptor complex bind to in the cell nucleus? And that's the promoter on the DNA. Next question, binding of the hormone receptor complex has a direct effect on, and the answer is transcription. Next question, what does messenger RNA code for? Protein. Next question on the mechanism of thyroxine action. How is thyroxine brought to the target cells? In association with thyroglobulin. Next question, does thyroxine pass through the cell membrane? The answer is yes, because it is hydrophobic, so it must act inside the cell instead of at the cell surface. Next question, what happens to T4? It's converted to T3. Next question, what does T3 stand for? Triiodothyronine. And the last question, where is the hormone response element? And it is in the promoter on the DNA, which is at the front of the gene, and that's basically the gateway to transcription. All right? So hopefully that makes sense in light of having watched the videos, and I'll see everybody in class. Thanks.